Hello all. This week is week 3 and we'll be covering David Hume. So David Hume is a pretty different philosopher from Descartes, although they existed during the same historical period. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing Hume, because it's an interesting point of contrast and you can see which method you sort of prefer. So before we actually get into day 1 reading, we'll first just cover what Hume is all about, and that includes some biography. So, a bit of biography here, as I said, Hume was alive from 1711 through 1776, so he was also an early modern philosopher, or sometimes called the Enlightenment. In particular, he was a member of the Scottish Enlightenment, so another famous figure was Adam Smith, who published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So apparently that was an important year for a number of reasons. In any case, Hume was a member of that sort of intellectual community and published a number of his own works. So before the inquiry concerning human understanding that we're reading, he wrote a treatise concerning human nature, which he said fell stillborn from the presses, so it died as soon as it was released. It was just never popular until well after he was dead, when people went back and studied it, because Hume had become famous at that point. He also wrote a history of England, which was actually a major source of income for him and a major text for generations to come, which just recounted English history for hundreds of years in quite some detail. And I guess another thing to add, most significantly, is that I'm not sure how I want to put that. Hume was a bro. Maybe that's too loaded of a concept. An everyday person. Hume was an everyday person, and all I mean here is that Hume, unlike Descartes, who was sort of apart from the happenings of everyday life and spent his life in bed or these sorts of things, Hume was known for having done things like a bit more traveling, although Descartes did do some traveling, and for going out and having drinks and being savvy in business and various other things. And I only mention this point because I think it's reflected in his philosophy. So we'll come to see what I mean in a minute. One of the most important concepts that you need to know is empiricist. So an empiricist is one who holds that knowledge is derived from the senses. So Hume argues against this notion of innate ideas, that we just have concepts built into the structure of our consciousness, and that we're basically, although this is someone else's phrase, we're basically a blank slate, and we learn everything about the world through experience. So you can see why empiricist is the key word here. So we learn by empirical means. And this is in sharp contrast to Descartes, who, as you recall, is a rationalist, and who thought that you could know everything from the fact that you exist to the fact that you have a soul to the existence of God as a result of reason alone, and that reason was the reliable method. So one of the reasons why we're going to read Hume is because he's a point of contrast, and this might be an interesting issue for you to focus on, whether or not you find empiricism or rationalism more persuasive, at least as it's represented in Hume as opposed to Descartes. Another interesting quote that Hume has, and he was one of the first to sort of acknowledge this thing, he says, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." So in general, people historically, like other famous philosophers, maybe Plato, thought that reason is preeminent, it's the thing that should dictate everything else about us. But Hume realized that people, being certain sorts of animals, are prone to care more about the passions, the things they care about are their instinctual desires and needs, than they are reason itself. And reason, as a general fact of human nature, is used instrumentally towards pursuing the various passions that we have. So people will employ their reason if they have a great striving for, money or something like that, right? They have this passion for power or for money or for sex or something like that, and then they'll use reason insofar as it facilitates their other interests. But people in general aren't the sorts of things that just want to rationalize in and of itself apart from actual living. Um, and so you can see why that might be a contrast from Descartes. So now with this little bit of background, um, we'll go more into what Hume actually says about the different species of philosophy. So this is the first day of reading, day 1, section 1 of the different species of philosophy. So the contrast is a subdivision of moral philosophy. So moral philosophy for Hume is just the science of human nature. So this could include economics, psychology, sociology. Hume, in the later portions of this reading, talks about how he wants to understand the secret springs and principles from which human understanding are derived, and in modern day terms, you might think that this is, at least in part, a matter of psychology. Likewise, you might wonder, the sorts of things that motivate people is a matter of economics or sociology. So, and there's also a certain sort of distinctly philosophical element to this too, just insofar as we traditionally understand morality as a field about what we should do. So humans have a certain inclination to do what they think they should do. So it might be interesting to study what in fact we should do. So just so you don't get too caught up on that notion of moral philosophy, it's this pretty broad conception. And the two subdivisions of moral philosophy are what I've called obvious philosophy. You might also see easy philosophy, and abstract philosophy or abstruse philosophy. And I wrote out a list of the various differences that he cites. So this is all fairly early on. It's about, so this is all before paragraph 5. So 2 through 4, in which he characterizes obvious philosophy as characterizing man as active being, as being easy to do, as being about common life and invoking common sense, and something that excites and regulates our sentiments. So obvious philosophy is stuff that, as you read it, you can just read along and be like, oh, that's an interesting idea. It's presenting something I already sort of believe, just in an interesting or kind of novel, exciting way. And insofar as it's already sort of tapping my latent sentiments, it's exciting, right? It's like, I've always sort of thought that, but this guy just writes it beautifully or something like that. So I'm sure you've had that experience. So not just philosophy does this, of course. Maybe literature can do this sort of thing, and you can imagine cases in which you read some play or maybe some philosophy and you're like, yeah, I really, I'm feeling what they're saying. So that's the sort of idea that motivates obvious philosophy. One historical point I just keep with Hume here is that nothing special is meant by man. He just means person. So don't worry about that. There are philosophers, when they say man, they mean male, but I don't think Hume is one of those. So, by way of contrast, there's abstract philosophy or abstruse philosophy, and this is considering man as a reasonable being, right? And by reasonable being, you might think like first and foremost a sort of thinking thing in the Cartesian spirit, where the first thing we do, rather than worry about what I'm going to eat or how I'm going to procreate or something like that, is like, what is it to be a being that exists in these sort of fundamental intellectual questions. It also, in a certain way, is very general. So, tries to find the sort of underlying principles that explain a whole range of phenomena. So, once again, invoking Descartes, you might consider his trademark argument that could explain the origin of basically all or nearly all ideas in terms of the fact that um, any idea that we have must have at least as much formal reality as objective reality. So the fact that we have ideas at all entails that there are objects which these, or at least entities, maybe not physical objects, but some sort of entity which these ideas sort of glom onto or refer to. And not that you need to worry about that in particular at this moment. We're dealing with Hume, but the point is that clearly it's dealing with everything, right? How we come to all ideas, and it's rather abstruse. It's really quite a sophisticated and somewhat strange argument to get there. And for this reason, you might think it's unintelligible to common readers, although hopefully um, you're not common readers or you've worked hard enough to be able to understand it. So that's just sort of the general distinction, and then think of a lot of what remains in this chapter, this section, as a sort of defense of philosophy. So this is the beginning of Hume's big treatise on human nature, on the way we think and why. And before even doing that, he's trying to justify why even do philosophy. So this is going towards that end. So the remainder of this will sort of explain why philosophy is worth doing, and then after he's established to his liking that philosophy is worth doing, then we can move on to the actual account of the human mind that he has. So I say philosophy or everyday life. Um, he sort of develops this contrast around paragraph 5 and 6, in which he says that in a certain way philosophy is remote from life. The sort of arguments and thoughts that occur in the comfort of an armchair wither away as soon as they get out of darkness and into real life, right? So you can think of the case of radical skepticism, for example, and find the idea totally intriguing and intellectually compelling. But of course, as soon as you go outside and you see a car speeding towards you, or you need to buy some food or something like that, this thought immediately vanishes and you say, there's a car, get out of the way, or man, I'm hungry, this food's going to nourish me. So in a certain sense, this sort of abstruse philosophy is remote. Um, and then by contrast, Hume says, but on the other hand, the mere ignorant is still more despised, nor is anything deemed a sure sign of a liberal genius in an age and nation where the sciences flourish than to be entirely destitute of all the relish for these noble entertainments. So reread that on your own. That's sort of a difficult sentence, but I find it compelling, and I also find it very relevant to our modern society. That might be a critique of large segments of our society today. So the mere ignorant here is ignorant is a noun in this sense. That's a person. So someone who is ignorant of any sort of sophisticated modes of thought is even more despised than the philosopher who questions whether or not there's really a computer in front of him. And one of the reasons why you might think this is because there's nothing worse than being such an ignoramus at a time when science flourishes. If you can't appreciate the marvels that science and intellectual life have brought us, even though you're living in it, there's something deeply wrong with you. At least that's kind of what Hume seems to suggest here. So I think it's an interesting thought, right? People sometimes, they hate on science or something like that, and seems rather strange considering that, there's a good chance that they're doing this sort of thing while using a computer or something like that. There's a kind of irony there, although phrasing it like that is dangerously close to making it an ad hominem, so I'll be careful. But so Hume's suggestion here is in keeping with his general everyday life, let's be a person before we're a philosopher kind of thing, is that we should have a mixed life. That being the sorts of organisms that we are, we need to be social. We need to satisfy our bodily impulses. We need to do work to feel happy about ourselves. And we also need to think. So if you're missing any of these components, you're not living like a full flourishing life, and your character is going to suffer the consequences. So this is a kind of rebuking of both philosophers and the ignorant in terms of, look, if you're just a philosopher and you don't go outside, you don't talk to other people, you never satisfy bodily impulses, like you're missing out on what it is to be a person. And same thing with the ignorant. If you only are social and you only worry about bodily impulses, you're not going to be fully appreciating what it is to be the sort of thing that we are. So Hume says, I guess this is directed towards all the academics that will read his work. Be a philosopher, but still, amidst all your philosophy, be still a man. And that's just kind of something to keep in your back pocket if you get deep into academia and you find yourself reading obscure texts and that sort of thing. Be first a person, and then do philosophy from the understanding that we're all people. So now that he's kind of established that, hey, so I'm not going to be like this extreme rationalist, and I'm not going to totally reject philosophy. We need to have some middle ground in which we do philosophy, but we recognize the fact that we're people, and that that's essential to what it is to do philosophy. So he moves on to try to justify the value of abstract philosophy. So before I say that some more, I guess one of the other conclusions that is key to draw from all of this, I guess maybe I could even write it back here. I guess it's already kind of stated, but it could be reiterated in a slightly different way. So fuse obvious and abstract philosophy. So part of the goal here for Hume is to do philosophy that is doing general principle sort of stuff, and it uses sophisticated arguments and that kind of thing, but it's also supposed to motivate and engage us and, titillate the passions. So this is kind of part of Hume's method. He doesn't want to just be strictly rationalist, but fuse his sort of impulses. Okay, so he still finds it necessary to provide some additional reasons to justify the value of abstract philosophy, and I just give you paragraph numbers where he provides the three reasons that he does give. So the first reason is that abstract philosophy gives exactness to the less abstruse. So one sort of maybe form of moral philosophy is art in this really broad general conception, insofar as it's dealing with the human nature in a certain sense. And so that's what we think, part of what it is to be good art maybe is to be something that's reflective of the human condition. So if that's the aim of art, you might think that abstruse philosophy can provide assistance to this sort of art, for example, or other less abstruse, easy philosophies, because it provides a certain sort of precision. So you might take the case of the hyper, or well, it's just realism, the sort of realist paintings that were going on during Hume's time, right? So these really detailed drawings that are able to very realistically represent sort of people's experience, people crying or people frolicking with joy. And this is a product of understanding optics, perspective, geometry, and these sorts of more abstruse principles. So these kind of abstruse principles allowed us to do art in a better way than it was able to be done before. So the abstract is essential even to the obvious. A second thought, and I like this one a lot, is the genius of abstract philosophy will diffuse. So he uses the example of politics as well, and he cites how modern governments are more stable than ancient governments, and part of that is hopefully because we have better systems that are a product of thinking about how government works and developing, you know, maybe proto checks and balances, that sort of thing. But the case that I want to invoke is, so for example, this genius of abstract philosophy will diffuse in even everyday learning. So you all, for example, your knowledge of fallacies will make you less, um, will make fallacies less effective in the future. So next time you're reading an article or listening to advertising, or especially as young voters, these sorts of frequent fallacious appeals to emotion or ignorance or whatever, or ad hominems are constant, won't be as effective because you'll recognize that they aren't good indicators of truth and they're not good arguments. So hopefully your vote will in some way be affected by the fact that you're more well educated, and so your voting will thereby be more informed, and this sort of trickling effect, this diffusion of abstract philosophy will mean that more competent people get into office as a result of people just employing these basic principles of reasoning to ensure that really bad thinkers and people that invoke fallacies aren't in positions of extreme power. Um, so maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think there's something to say for that. And then he also says that, and this might not apply to everyone, but it certainly applies to some, that there's a certain intrinsic value to doing abstract philosophy, that it's a sort of mental exercise, just like certain people are workout fanatics and they really need to, run 10 miles to get that runner's high and to feel good about themselves or whatever. Some people really need to push themselves intellectually and take on some serious mental challenges in order to feel satisfied and interested. And so you might have that, and it's sort of an acquired taste, but it is something that is hard to compare with. So those are just reasons to value abstract philosophy, right? So even with these in mind, Hume worries that there are possible objections to doing philosophy. Maybe it's still not worth it for us to do philosophy, foremost because philosophy proliferates error. So Hume's willing to admit that there's been plenty of crazy systems. That's almost another feature of this sort of abstruse philosophy, is that whereas easy philosophy, obvious philosophy, will stop its results if it gets too out there, abstruse philosophy is only trying to rationalize, so it doesn't matter how counterintuitive the results are. If the philosopher thinks the argument follows, they're going to be committed to this claim. And so in the history of early modern philosophy around this time, there's all sorts of crazy. I mean, if you're interested, you could look up, for example, Leibniz's monadology. Just you could Google monad, and you'll probably get a whole article on the monads, and you can read about it. And just as a sort of case of how philosophy proliferates error and how it might be counterproductive if it's just giving crazy theories. But Hume says, but if we're just to stop philosophy or philosophizing, if we just discontinue doing philosophy, what we're doing is we're leaving the matter to superstition. In the wake of our retreat of, of the reasonable approach to thinking about difficult topics, we're just leaving it up to, just whatever miscellaneous forces that happen to fill the void, whatever sort of folk psychology or other, sort of doctrinal things that will end up trying to explain the human mind or morality or whatever other sorts of things we're interested in understanding. So it seems like, insofar as it's the lesser of two evils, there's a certain minimal duty to continue to do philosophy. Otherwise, we'll just, be leaving superstition to spread ignorance. So, he also says that why not think that although there's been error in the past, why not think that philosophy can be successful? So he says, like in astronomy, steady work may reveal the springs and principles which underpin the human mind. Um, and here's a quote, and I should quote as such. So he says, and there is no reason to despair of equal success as astronomy in our inquiries concerning the mental powers and economy, if prosecuted with equal capacity and caution. It is probable that one operation and principle of the mind depends on another, which again may be resolved into one more general and universal. So you can see this sort of picture in which, if we study carefully, we might be able to get a picture of how the human psyche works that can reduce to just a few very general principles and thereby come to an understanding of the mind. So here he's sort of implicitly invoking Newton, and so later on, some commentators have called Hume the Newton of the mind, because Newton was able to explain a whole range of sort of mystifying phenomena, right? So there's all these celestial bodies moving around in all sorts of seemingly semi-random ways, and it was just like beyond comprehension as to how we could make sense of it. And of course, people are going to be like, "Oh, you know, those stargazers, they're just looking up and making up things, and don't listen to them." And after some time, guys like Copernicus and Newton were able to make sense of the movement of celestial bodies in terms of a few simple principles. Um, so hopefully Hume thinks that we'll be able to do a similar thing with the mind. And certainly we've made progress into the 21st century, although not as quickly as astronomy. Um, so, so why should we do philosophy? Well, even though it's prone to error, one, we shouldn't leave it up to superstition, and two, if we work hard, there's still a good chance that we can find whatever mechanisms that underpin all of the psyche, and wouldn't that be quite the find? So, last but not least, there's a few other thoughts. If it hasn't already been obvious, he's not for radical skepticism, right? Um, so he seems to suggest that it's somewhat artificial to doubt everything. So, for example, nor can there remain any suspicion that this science is uncertain and chimerical, unless we should entertain such skepticism as entirely subversive of all speculation and even action. So here, this is kind of a jab at Descartes, who might say that, oh, we can't know anything about the human mind except for that it thinks or something like that. But Hume just says, well, this is crazy because this is subversive to every sort of inquiry and even action. Like, you're not going to be able to live as a radical skeptic, so why would you feign that position? And then I already noted this once before, but this is sort of the conclusion that I just tried to identify early. The goal here is to unite obvious and abstract philosophy so that we have a rigorous, systematic way to both appeal to commonsensical principles that we can all agree upon, and to find general principles that everyone that will explain a wide range of phenomena. So in the next lecture, we'll start getting into some of those principles, and Hume tries to rely on some obvious observations and then draw out some general principles. So I hope that was helpful, and of course, if you have questions, ask. All right, thanks. Bye.